Hey Monarchs, this is Ms. Hayes, and today we are going to talk about how to embed evidence into your writing. Please take a moment to make a Cornell Notes page, and here we go. So the first thing you need to do if you get a prompt that tells you to use textual evidence in your writing is to keep calm and use textual evidence. Your essential question for today is, how can I use textual evidence in my writing to support my claims? Please copy this down into the essential question section of your notes. All right, so before you actually start learning how to embed evidence, you need to know why to embed evidence. And there are 3 reasons. The first reason is to establish credibility. So you need evidence to prove that you're a reliable and credible source of information. And also, the stronger your evidence, the more likely you are to win an argument. And everybody loves to win arguments. The second reason is to rock the standards. The Common Core State Standards, which are the standards that teachers use to know what to teach you, value the ability to use textual evidence more than any other skill. The Common Core State Standards are basically, they rule everything. Your job is to prove to me that you have met the standard, that you are proficient in that standard, and my job is to teach you how to be proficient in that standard. The standards rule the classroom. So here's an example of every single standard that uses textual evidence or that requires you to use textual evidence. So you can see that there are a bunch of them. The third reason you need to know how to use textual evidence in your writing is so that you can pass the PARCC exam. And the PARCC exam is your high school exit exam. So every single question on the English PARCC exam tests your ability to use textual evidence. Seriously, every single question. So here is every type of question you may come across on the PARCC exam. You can see in the essay response example, it says that you need to use support from both texts in developing your response. And that is basically another way of saying to use textual evidence to support your claims. If you look at the example on the left, Part A asks you to answer a question, and Part B asks you to use evidence that contradicts your answer to Part A. Many questions like this also ask you to use evidence to support your answer to Part A. And then if you look at the example on the right, it says that you need to summarize this story by selecting 4 major elements from the list. Well, every single element is textual evidence. So you have to know how to use textual evidence. So here's how you actually embed evidence into your writing. And it's a 3-step process. So the first step for embedding evidence is to introduce the source and the author. If you haven't already done so earlier in your document, you also should provide comments about the source or the author. Now, you don't always have to provide comments about the source or the author, but it's good to do if you have comments to add. The second step is to provide a paraphrase or direct quotation to support your claim. And you need to make sure that you begin with a verb and end with a parenthetical citation. Far too often, students will just drop a quote into their paper without introducing it with a verb. So you have to have a verb. So to add your verb, you're going to pull one of the phrases from the left. So you could use the author, the character, whoever's name, the speaker, the narrator, the article, the antagonist, the protagonist. Who's speaking? Who said whatever it is that you're about to quote? And then you need your verb. So you could use any of the verbs from this list. You could use acknowledges, addresses, admits, agrees, concludes, concurs. You could say disagrees, denies. Any of these words will work. But you can't just pull a word from this list and say, okay, I have a word. You have to make sure that it actually makes sense. So don't say that the author agrees with your statement and then put a statement that disagrees with what you're trying to prove, because then you'll just look like you don't know what the heck you're doing. So make sure that you pull a verb that fits. The third step is to comment on why the evidence you used is important or relevant to the prompt or somehow significant to your claim. And you should always refer back to the evidence in this statement. And this should be between 1 to 3 sentences. So here are some examples. First, we have to introduce the source and the author. So in this example, they introduced the author first, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, or the AILA, and then they introduced the source. in their article, immigrants are a vital component of American society. And what I like about this example is that they tell you what type of source they're pulling from. If it's an article, say an article. If it's a short story, say it's a short story. If it's a poem, say it's a poem. So identify the genre of the text that you're pulling from. And then the second step is to paraphrase or quote, and they included a verb and a parenthetical citation. So they use the verb maintains that, and then in this case they paraphrased, they didn't quote, they put the evidence into their own words. And they said, immigrants in America make every effort to assimilate. Now notice the number 64 in parentheses at the end. That's your parenthetical citation. So 64 is the page number that this came from, or if you don't know the page number, it could also be the paragraph number. But you don't say page 64. You just put the number in parentheses. And then your period goes after your parenthetical citation, not before. So now let's look at the third step, which is how they commented on why the evidence they used is important or relevant or significant. So they said this position, and that's where they refer back to the evidence, refutes a common belief held by critics of immigration that foreign-born Americans refuse to learn English and do not embrace the American way of life. So in this case, their explanation, that's in red. That's the information that tells us how this quote is significant to the prompt. Basically, they're telling us what to think about their evidence. Let's look at another example. So in this example, we have, in the article, the threat of terrorism is being reduced. That's the source. John Ashcroft, the author. And then this example gives us more information about the author or additional comments about the source or the author. So they said the U.S. Attorney General. So now we know that John Ashcroft is the U.S. Attorney General. Notice how that additional information is set up by commas. That's because we could take that out. That's called an appositive phrase, and those appositive phrases should be able to be pulled straight out of your text. So we set it off with commas to prove that it's an interrupter. And then they use the verb claims that, and in this case they used a quote, terrorism is relatively inexpensive to conduct and devilishly difficult to counter, and our parenthetical citation, it says viewpoint 27. Since this is an article that they're quoting, then it's safe to assume that Viewpoint is the magazine that they're quoting from. So they put the title of the magazine itself, so we know where to find it. And 27 is still the page number. And our period still goes after. And then we have our explanation, our third step. This point being the quote, is troublesome. America is spending billions of dollars on the war on terror and using its military might to fight an elusive enemy. So again, they're telling us what to think about this evidence. And then in the last example, we have, in his article, global warming is a serious threat to humanity's future. So in this case, we have the source, Mark Linus, the author, and our additional information, the author of High Tide, News from a Warming World. Second step, he argues that is our verb, and then he paraphrased here. In other parts of the world, flooding, drought, and sea level rise are forcing people to leave their homes, creating environmental refugees. And then we have our parenthetical citation telling us that this is on page 123, and our period at the very end. And now for our explanation, it is important for us to consider this point being where they refer back to that quote that they just pulled, that paraphrase, because mass displacement of human life could have severe consequences for communities all around the globe. So let's review. Step one is to identify the source and the author and provide comments about the source and the author. Step two is to provide a paraphrase or a direct quotation, and we start with a verb and end with a parenthetical citation. And then step three is to comment on how that evidence is important to the point that you're trying to prove, the prompt, or your thesis statement, or your topic sentence, or your claim. So here's a quick little graph showing you one of the articles that we used and what it looks like once you've put it all together. And that's all I have for you for today. Please take a moment to chunk your notes. Also, you need to write possible test or quiz questions, at least one per chunk in your notes. You also need to summarize your notes by answering the essential question, and then go back and highlight all of the main ideas or keywords in your notes. And if you have any questions, you can email me at kelly.hayes@aps.edu, or you can check out my website at misshayes.org, and I will see you tomorrow.